So hello everyone, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm not a very loud speaker, so you cannot hear me, just wave at me and I'll try and be louder. What I would like to add to the discussion today is an understanding of diachronic properties of the main street and essentially try and see what are these features in terms of urban morphology and the role of the street in the urban fabric that enable their unique character and profile over time. And I will start by saying that the death of the main street, or otherwise called High Street, is a very present concern in the UK. So these are news piece titles all from 2018. And it has been affecting not only independent stores but chain stores as well, and generally town centres, to the point that the Parliament, through the Committee for Housing, Communities and Local Government, has put onwards and forwards a petition in order to set up an inquiry on what is happening to these places, how can they respond to demographic and technological change, and what can the government, the local government, do in order to help them. So it's a very present discussion. Now, my research focuses on the life cycle of buildings, specifically urban housing typologies, how they have survived over time, how have they changed over time, and why is it that some building types like row houses, terraced houses, or simple ordinary architectural building units have managed to survive way longer than modern and postmodernist developments. So that's how where I started from. And what I was asking is this a problem of where they are in the city? Does that relate to how they connect to their surroundings? Is it a problem of how we design them? Or is it a problem of what kind of activities they shelter and how they do that? And I was interested in finding out how does that play out in terms of long-term processes, so that we don't have to recycle our buildings so often in terms of urban design and planning. And this is basically the variables, the three variables that I'm going to touch upon today, looking at main streets and their role in two historical urban settings. So it's a historical study. I'll talk about the capability of their build form to be adaptable over time. So what was the morphological features that kind of enabled this? And essentially I'd like to probe us on thinking whether we are actually doing enough or the right things to protect these features as a way of going forward. The two case studies I'm going to talk about is Islington in London and the West Village in Manhattan, and you see an overview of these case studies. So as I said, it's a historical study in the fact that it goes backwards in time. So I started mapping in around 1891 for New York and 1911 for the UK case study. But it's also a historical study because at the time that I mapped this and surveyed these neighborhoods, it was around 2011 to 2013. So it's now a historical study. But I've mapped around 8,000 facades overall and about 13,000 doorways in these areas. And I'll start by talking about the spatial profile of the main streets, and specifically main streets that are very essential and vibrant places for the community. And what I'd like to highlight is that I found that these places were not just any other kind of retail corridor. They were in a way operating as a threshold between the city and the neighborhood scales, so either in between the two. So the methods and theory I've used in order to study the street network, the layout of these urban places, are based on space syntax theory. This is what Conrad touched upon. And it's a theory that got developed in the 1970s in UCL, in University College London, and essentially what it does is that it translates the street network, the streets, into simple lines of access and sight. And this is based on the principle that people will most likely navigate in the city, all other things being equal, based on how far they can see and how far they can go. That's the pathway we usually follow. And it has been found that after doing this kind of translation and analyzing the cities as mathematical graphs in a way, in terms of relationships of connectivity, there have been a series of studies that kind of suggest that pedestrian flows correlate with this kind of results. So in this kind of map and visualization, which is produced by a specific software, the warmer the color, the higher the chance that, or the probability that someone will use this street as part of a passing through route or a destination, according to which measure you are using in order to analyze the network. So that's what I've used as a basis for analyzing Islington and the West Village. So Islington started as a dormitory village. It then became a recreational suburb, a suburb for recreational purposes. But because of its proximity to the city, very early on, it became densely populated and transformed into an urban area. Now you see the two main streets, Upper Street and Essex Road, and similar to what Connor did, I've mapped the historical networks over 3 periods of time, and these picked up the two main streets. So the two main streets were the ones that are more prominent within the spatial network in that area. Now, what was interesting to find out is that actually the high street, the street that was more prominent for the local people, was not the most accessible street in terms of the citywide connection. So it's not just a retail corridor that is very well connected. It was a street that was kind of protected by citywide pedestrian flows. It's still accessible, but protected. And once I looked at the street within its proximity, then the high street became more important than the citywide, let's say, connection. So it is a street that is locally very important, but is somewhat protected from citywide flows. And in a way, by mapping transformations of buildings, that led me to find out that patterns of urban change were slowly applied in a slower manner in the high street than in these high accessibility corridors. That street had, if you see here, the higher percentage of non-domestic users, but not only retail, third space and commerce. There was a mixture of users, and still there was domestic use in that street. And you see specifically how that street kind of maintained its historical profile. So there were cinemas, theaters that were sort of like maintaining the attitude of it being a destination for recreation. And considering the surroundings and the citywide, let's say, connector, the high street maintained a denser encounter rate in terms of doorways. So it kept a direct relationship between the buildings and the street at a denser manner than what was happening in the immediate surroundings. And I found similar patterns in the West Village in Manhattan. So the West Village is a unique case because of how it kind of interfaces with the commissioner's plan. So it deviates from the green. And again, that meant that the area was protected from citywide flows after the plan was developed. And here you see the difference again between the streets that are found to be important at the local scale, at a walkable scale of 800 meters, let's say, and the streets that are found to be important when we are looking at the wider street network of Manhattan. Two streets were picked up generally important at the local and neighborhood and extended neighborhood level. So you see the radius of analysis, 7th Avenue and Bleecker Street. And if you read about the historical, the history of the place, and also visit the place, you'll see that Bleecker Street has a quite different character than 7th Avenue, 6th Avenue, and even Hudson Street. And while these streets are quite prominent at a local and extended neighborhood level, at the city level we see again this stark difference between how relevant 7th Avenue is compared to the local highs, to the local main street that was more relevant for the local community, which was Bleecker Street. So again, Bleecker Street was not as prominent as 7th Avenue when we were looking at citywide connections. So Bleecker Street is one of the streets that is being mentioned by Lockwood in Bricks and Brownstones as one of the very early streets that was known in Greenwich Village. So it is a historical street. And I was interested in, again, whether that was the case historically. So I recompiled the Bromley sheets of a map altogether to map the historical street networks in New York. So if you're wondering how I came about that, that was a mapping process. And by having this 4-time series and looking again at the prominence of these specific streets, again I found that Bleecker Street was consistently weaker compared to the others in terms of the citywide connections. But it was doing very well at a local level. Now, West Village is an area that has been supported by community activism, local stakeholders caring about the area, and in a way their interests were reflected in the zoning map that was effective in 1961. And commerce spread around the area, and there was an effort to protect the wiping out of all these row houses in order to build new residential, primarily developments. You see here again how the density of retail was in a way spread outside the area, but there's higher clustering around the main streets, and specifically Bleecker Street again had a very dense interface of retail activity. These are historical mappings of uses, so these are not doorways, they're actually points allocated to a facade. So the point that I'd like to make from this first part about the spatial profile of main streets is that their spatial significance refers mainly to local community. They have a very distinct spatial profile, but at the same time they are protected from high density citywide pedestrian flows while being incredibly accessible within their surroundings. And there is evidence from research in the UK High Street that kind of supports this idea that the main street is the High Street is a protected in a way street from the wider surroundings. And they maintain over time a sociable sidewalk micromorphology. Now I've done extensive study on that I haven't actually showed, but there was measures associated with the threshold frequency and the diversity of uses associated to that threshold. So these streets support a dense and diverse interface of building uses over time. And the following question was then how were the buildings able to respond to this change? So both terrace houses and row houses started off as houses, but then became mixed-use units. So how were they able to accommodate these changes? What was the kind of adaptable features that we have in the building form? Now, Professor Laura Vaughan from the Space Syntax Laboratory has extensively researched that in terms of the factors that enable diversity of uses within the high street, both as a result of the street network effects, but also of the building form properties. And I'm showing this here. It's an open access book, which you can access in case you're interested in finding out more about the UK case of a high street and how it changed over time, the challenges that it faces. But specifically about the two areas that I've studied, a point that I like to make is that if you see here, this is a relationship between the different types of buildings and the density of the threshold, and whether the block facades are built up or not. And what I found is that in pink color you see the historical type, so it's a row house or a terraced house, and in gray are the new built, in a way, developments. And essentially row houses were found at blocks that were more built up across the street and had denser interface in terms of doorways and facades, and the same was the case for West Village. So in both cases, these buildings did not survive just because of their own properties or because they were protected of citywide flows, so of, let's say, patterns of urban change. At 1969 onwards, there were conservation areas that kind of were put in place in order to protect them from being demolished and from higher rates of change. What I'd like to stress is that that doesn't necessarily mean that eventually, in the long term, we end up with protecting the place. And I'd like to highlight a difference between the two attitudes. So in Islington, it's not necessarily representative of all the UK cases, but in Islington, in that particular area, the local council was interested in preserving and protecting not only just the buildings alone, but also the characteristics of the layout of roads, of the paving, of the kind of uses, the interfaces, the tree lines, everything that makes up the local familiar scene. And it was interesting for me to find out there was a kind of spark correlation between the collective, in a way, accessibility of an area and the share that they had in terms of domestic and non-domestic users. So there was a curatorial, let's say, process of where users are allocated and how, and specifically on the main street, the council regulates how many, let's say, types of users you will have alongside that street. So it's a curatorial process that aims to protect the neighborhood and the area overall, not just the buildings themselves. Now, in the case of West Village, the historic preservation started off as protecting the single row houses. There were efforts to kind of protect commercial interests in the area from the various associations that are operating there, but the preservation alone, or the conservation, was mainly focusing on the row houses themselves as unique features that have remained and survived over time. So you might end up with very specific and strange shapes here, like just preserving one block. So it wasn't in a way neighborhood oriented or street oriented. And in a way, there was extreme kind of demolition happening alongside the waterfront, and these were the most segregated paths, but extreme demolition continued to happen around the waterfront even after the preservation was sort of put in place. So this cluster, this delimitation of the West Village Historic District in a way created a stark difference between what was happening in the immediate surrounding. And the point I'm trying to make is that we cannot see places detached from what is happening in their relationship with the city, both for the high street and both for when thinking in areas overall. So the progress, let's say, or retail activity of a neighborhood will depend on what is happening right in the next neighborhood. Both are creating opportunities and also the other way around. So if we were to have Jane Jacobs today, would they say that the village was protected? Not necessarily. There were in the 1960s, when abstract expressionists were renting out houses in the area of West Village, they could rent, let's say, a room in a row house for $17 a week. And now apparently there's a row house with a sorted facade in Bedford Street that was on the rental market for $14,000 a month. That's in 2011. So in a way, how do we treat these places in order to understand them dynamically as they evolve throughout the city? And that's my main point, that we need to be thinking about temporal change. How often do we collect data? What do we do with data latency? When do things stop being relevant? How can we think about the parts and whole relationship, both on how the street relates to the neighborhood, but also the neighborhood relates to the city, and understand change at different scales, and also think about the dynamic synergy of places. So rather than adding artificial boundaries in terms of policy making, what can we do in order to understand how streets behave, both as local connectors, but also within their wider setting? Thank you.